Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm president of Societe de Chimie Industrielle and head of programs. And I want to welcome all of you to this session, which I'm very excited about because it's a very important topic. And we have two very good panelists joining me as part of the three-person panel on this issue of the evolving impact of ESG on the chemical industry. Before I do introductions and we start this session, I want to just mention two things. One is those of you who are not familiar with Societe, but I think most of you probably are, it's a 102-year-old nonprofit that has a number of different missions, ranging from this kind of educational process where we take important topics that are important to industry leaders and the people serving the industry, whether it's ESG or sustainability or catalysts or electronic vehicles. So we go through that, and we've had thus far this year. This is the 22nd webcast we've done this year, and I think we've served a large number of people. The other, of course, is we give scholarships for students who are studying chemistry, chemical engineering, or biotech, biochemistry. We have mentor programs for them. And we also have career fairs. We had one for chemicals in March. We have one in October for life sciences. For those of you who are companies that serve the life science industry or in the life science industry, and you want to participate because it's a wonderful way to recruit top-notch students in a virtual environment, please contact Danielle Fraser at Societe. Last time we ended up with students from the 25 leading chemical engineering schools and 150 students in 10 companies. And my understanding is all 10 companies made job offers to one or more students. So it was very successful. And the last thing, of course, is we have the International Palladium Medal Award, which we try to give every 2 years. So if you are not a member, you should think about doing it, or at least at a minimum, come to our events. And we have a number of very interesting ones, coming up that you can find on our webpage, societe.org. In terms of this event, we're going to take the rest of this first hour, and we're going to have a panel discussion on the topic. We're going to leave some time for questions and answers at the end, maybe the last 5-10 minutes. And the way you ask questions is just type them into the chat box, and all the three of us will be able to see the questions, and we'll take as many as time permits. The other twist, though, is that we're going to give you an opportunity to talk to the speakers at tables and to talk to each other. So this platform that we're using, at the end of this panel, at exactly 2:00, I'll push a button and all of you will end up in an electronic ballroom. And what you're going to see is it's as if you were hovering above all the tables. You can see all the tables and the seats and who's sitting in the seats. And then you can just click on a seat, and then magically you're going to be able to see everyone at the table. And each table can handle up to eight people. Joe and Rob and I both, all three of us, have agreed to man one of the tables, and so you can either sit down and chat with one of us, or you can go to another table and meet up with other people and just get to know them. So it's trying to recapture some of the networking fun that we have at our luncheon meetings, which obviously have been difficult to do once the pandemic hit. So with that, let me start out by just introducing the topic. So ESG, which is short for environmental, social, and governance, has become a dominant topic in all parts of government and business. 3 or 4 years ago, maybe there was some mention, and maybe some mention of some subset like sustainability or environmental, but it has really become a hot topic that is on the pages of the Wall Street Journal and other the Financial Times virtually every day. And the key ESG issues that have been identified as urgent problems, and I think basically the sense of urgency has really started for a variety of reasons, ranging from the climate change problem, which is clearly people are beginning to feel that we're now at a serious crossroads, to the ongoing environmental issues. But the other is on the G side, which is the governance, and also the S side, social, the need to promote diversity and inclusion and fair employment practices and safety, and things that are not related to environmental, but are just equally important. So some of the things that are in environmental, of course, are global warming, carbon footprint, energy and resource management, pollution, renewable resources. Some of the things under social are diversity, inclusion, data privacy, health and safety. And some of the things under governance are board composition, corruption, regulatory management, et cetera. It's fairly broad, covers lots of different things, but we're going to hope to let you become more educated on some of these issues, but also what the impact is and what you have to do about it. So we have 6 questions that we want to go through. And I think the first one is expanding on what I said in terms of the basic definition. How are people, and that people being companies, rating agencies, et cetera, defining ESG? Are there some differences? And in the categories under this overall topic. So maybe I'll start out arbitrarily. Joe, you want to start?
Sure, Peter, and thanks for this. So, just generally, I guess for companies, ESG is really moving away from just focusing on shareholder value and instead broadening this out to all stakeholders, employees, communities, customers. And of course, many aspects of ESG can be quite subjective, especially the social part. I mean, what gender and racial ethnicity balance is ideal? How much should companies contribute to social and community programs, and which ones? In the chemical industry, there's an example. FMC is targeting 50% women in the global workforce and 14% Black and African Americans in the US workforce by 2027, and also the board being a third women by 2026. So are these the right numbers? I mean, it's pretty subjective. And also, how do you rate something like developing plastics recycling technologies? That's really tough to measure the impact. But there are some aspects, especially in environmental, that are more measurable in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, energy and water usage. But the challenge overall is measuring ESG efforts within a similar or uniform framework so you can compare company to company. So ratings firms, they use company information.
Well, we're not going to talk about ratings yet. We're just talking about the definition of ESG.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
sure.
That's question number 5, right? So, Rob, you want to talk just on the definition? You want to chat about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the definition, I mean, companies have, Peter mentioned the great interest of ESG. I'll start with a bit of an anecdote. Peter mentioned that the interest of ESG in the last 2 years. Actually, before this, I did a Google Trends search on ESG just to see how popular it is. And it's interesting in that in the fall of 2019, it just took off. I mean, ESG has been in the background. It's been a term for 15, 20 years. But in the fall of 2019, it just took off. And, queries on Google have essentially tripled since the fall of 2019. It's been in a straight line up. So, I mean, that just provides some context for, why we're talking about this topic and the level of interest that it's essentially tripled in the last year and a half, almost 2 years. And I'm sure companies are feeling that. You're probably spending, 2 or 3 times as much more attention, or fielding, 2 or 3 times as many questions from investors and the public about it. But just in terms of how they define it, I mean, I think right now, I think what companies are doing is, looking at the disclosures they've made around governance, transparency, environmental, and sustainability for decades. I think that's how they've been defining this and quickly putting it together into this broader and more integrated ESG framework. Like companies have been very familiar with the E and the G for decades. I mean, the responsible care and codes go back to 1988. Corporate governance. The SEC first required public companies to have an audit committee of independent and board members in 1976, and that's where the term corporate governance came from. So that's this has been going back for decades. S is more recent, but companies for many years have been talking about diversity and inclusion and labor relations. So I think right now it's the definitions are being set, but I think you're seeing a realignment around disclosures that companies have made for decades and putting it into this more integrated framework. So I don't think the definitions are changing. It's just how they're reported, the lens that they're looked at, and the specific focus areas or what's being defined, and it's still being defined.
Yeah, and to reinforce what Rob said, he cited some numbers in terms of numbers of times that people are mentioning or searching ESG. Yep. Another one, and probably the thing that's created the most attention getting for companies, is the amount of money that is now being allocated to invest in companies that have better ESG profiles. And just to put some numbers around that, in 2018, the number of total assets under management that were dedicated towards ESG was 12.4 billion. In 2019, it was 34.5 billion, and in 2020, 106.1 billion, and it's continuing to go up. So, that famous movie where it says "Show me the money." Well, you really can get people's attention if it affects whether their money goes into their stock or not, and their stock price goes up. So that's escalated the attention that CEOs of public companies, anyway, and fund managers, right, have paid to this whole topic. But I got to tell you, it's kind of wild, wild west, because we talk about the categories and so forth. The real headache is the fact that there are expectations, but it's really hard for people to figure out how to grade themselves, right? Or what data to produce. I mean, I sat last night in front of the number 2 person at a bank, and he said, we got to report all this stuff, but there's so many different standards and so many different measures. And then how do you measure? So we're a bank. How do we measure our carbon footprint, right? And so forth. So it's really a challenge. So that's a good segue into this issue of standards, both qualitative and quantitative, that have been established. What standards are being proposed by whom, and where are we headed in terms of standards? Joe, we'll start with you again.
Sure. As you mentioned, Peter, I mean, there's so many standards and frameworks when it comes to ESG reporting. And, some of the big ones are global reporting initiatives. That's a GRI. You have the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB. Others, it's really an alphabet soup of reporting standards: TCDF, CDP, CDSB, IIRC. So, companies will typically use one or more of these standards, and also some will try to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, and there are about 17 of these. It's very broad, like clean water and sanitation, gender equality, and climate action. One recent development, though, is that 5 of these reporting standards groups have announced that they'll work together to launch a climate-related financial disclosure standard. And also the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, is preparing rules for mandatory climate risk disclosures by the end of the year. So there could be a standards board like the FASB, that's a Financial Accounting Standards Board. On a global basis, the G7 group of countries have also called for mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. So you can see where this is all going. Right now, as you mentioned, it's still all over the place, but there is a clear direction towards uniformity and regulation when it comes to reporting standards.
But they got a long way to go.
Sure.
Yeah. In fact, we did a count. There are 600 ESG ratings. 600, and 600 is clearly very difficult to manage.
Yep.
Yeah.
Rob, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, Joe highlighted some of the big ones, but I think one of the interesting things is the shift from really qualitative to quantitative. The Global Reporting Initiative goes back to 97, and most of industry for the last 15, 20 years, that's been the standard in terms of how companies have reported on issues that have on ESG related issues. Obviously, ESG has evolved greatly over the last 15 to 20 years, but it's been more qualitative. GRE is written or the reports take into account, broad stakeholders. So that means companies, regulators, the public, and investors is a subset of that. And it's really, more contextual information about an organization and their reporting practices and, their strategy and ethics and around it, and their reporting processes. But I think the evolution that you're seeing and is the shift toward investor-driven standards, and those big ones, and Joe mentioned them both, with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. These are much more granular, quantitative metrics that are being developed. These two appear to be what is certainly, I'll call them early leaders. Certainly the ones to pay attention. I think a lot of that is driven by, BlackRock, which, if you're a public company, the largest institutional investor in the world, if you're a public company, BlackRock essentially owns 5 to 10% of your stock. So you have to listen to them, and they're heavily pushing, or they actually want companies to report in accordance with SASB and TCFD guidelines by this year. So you're seeing a lot of attention there. But BASF has reported along the lines of SASB. Dow, for the first time this year, has reported according to an SASB index. So they it's not quite audited yet, but they're getting in line. So I think people are starting to really get behind this standard, and I think the interesting thing to watch there is that these are investor driven, right? So it's not, they're not talking about broad stakeholder engagement, but they're really granular. They're quantitative standards, and they're driven by investors, as opposed to GRI, which had many more stakeholders in mind. So I think that's the evolution that you're seeing.
Yeah, and I think I want to emphasize, though, first of all, that not all of these things are quantifiable. Some of the things like inclusion, there's no way you can create a metric on whether you have more or less inclusion. So some of them are easy. So emissions, that's easy. You can measure it, you can set a standard, and so forth. So it's all over the place. So depending upon what area of ESG, your ability to set standards or not can vary in terms of quantitative, and some are going to be more qualitative. But the interesting thing, though, is that there's so much of a penalty on companies if they're found out to have published data that is inconsistent with what their actual practice is. And Deutsche Bank just got into trouble because their ranking systems clearly internally were different from what they were actually publishing. And companies that publish, okay, this is how we perform relative to these standards, and it's found out that actually they were more of a polluter, whatever, they're really getting punished for that, either legally or in the stock market. But in a sense, a lot of them are saying, wow, this is like really impossible. It's like you say, you want me to get an A on this test, but you don't tell me what the criteria is, the complete criteria. And I'm sympathetic to that, because if you look, at the disparity of standards and so forth, but at this point, they don't have a choice. In other words, you can complain, but they don't have a choice, right? You don't have a choice.
No.
Because if you don't, no one's going to say, well, we forgive you for the fact that you felt that the standards were too confusing. We're not going to let you off the hook, right?
Right.
So this next question is this. By the way, in terms of chemicals, the good and bad news for chemicals is that we've been under scrutiny for a really long time in the environmental area. So chemicals is really used to meeting certain standards on pollution and so forth. But now moving into these other areas are things that are new, right? They've never had to deal with, a lot of these social and governance, governance parameters. So along those lines, next question is, how are companies attempting to meet these standards and report their performance in various ESG categories?
So to me, yeah, I can just say
Go ahead, Joe.
yeah,
Joe.
sure. I guess, in terms of, in their sustainability reports, some are going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions, others on diversity, equity, and inclusion, others on community programs, or a combination of these factors. And as I mentioned, companies will pick the reporting standards they align with, if any, and some will also try to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Just specific to the chemical industry, I mean, you're seeing more and more companies aligning to that target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. With intermediate goals to 2030, where you'll typically see between 25 to 35% reductions. And you saw LyondellBasell today. They just announced today that particular goal for net zero by 2050. Sasol just announced that last week. And the companies will have to get to that. And, a lot of this, I think, will involve electrification of production processes and the growing use of renewable energy. But the thing is, some disclose carbon emissions and targets in terms of meeting these standards. Some don't. Some have targets. Some don't, but say they're going to announce targets. Some targets on greenhouse gas emissions are absolute reductions, as mentioned, and some are reductions in carbon intensity. So it's all still very inconsistent. I'll just give one example. Berkshire Hathaway, they strive to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but that's it. There's no date for that.
So they plan on meeting that goal, right?
Sure. But yeah, again, everyone's, putting different, some will have timetables, some won't. Some say absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Others will say intensity for now.
Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of, trying to meet the standards and report, Joe mentioned sort of the net zero commitments that are starting to proliferate. Things around circularity and, reporting. I think one of the big things that ESG is driving is really, an integration of what was, until recently, parallel or even separate efforts around, disclosures around environment, sustainability, transparency, even the SEC related disclosures around, labor relations, mine safety, and, sourcing of, things like tantalum. So I think, what ESG is driving is really integrating this into a framework. And, we talked about some of the standards and some of the different organizations that are starting to promulgate these, but I think what you're starting to see in industry is trying to integrate this into a kind of a coherent framework in terms of reporting. Like I meant, Dow this year first had its first integrated ESG report. So its sustainability and CSR report are now integrated into an ESG report. BASF is starting to report ESG metrics in lines with SASB standards. So I think what you're starting to see is really an integration of the many things that a company that ESG makes up into a whole framework. And I think that's the big change in terms of how companies are reporting performance and even setting these standards like net zero targets, circularity targets, broader emissions targets. So I think that's the big change that you're saying.
Yeah, and I think companies overall are, in terms of this question about what companies doing, are focusing attention. But it's interesting. how serious the problem depends on what industry you're in, right? Even within chemicals, some are more have more issues around ESG than others. But the other is a question also of size. I think the larger companies have the resources and people to put together an ESG department and people who can tabulate and so forth. As you get to the small to medium sized companies, and in the chemical industry, we have so many small to medium sized companies, right? That's a bigger challenge for them, right? Because they don't have the same resources to hire the consultants or hire the people to monitor this. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the chemical industry, which is for the small to medium sized companies. It's going to be a challenge for them because the amount of resources required to measure this are not trivial.
Yep. Yeah, I don't want to sidetrack this too much, but I think that's a critical point in terms of how these are developing, because for smaller and mid-sized firms, this is going to go basically directly to your. You may not be a publicly traded companies, but if you're borrowing from a bank, or even if you're a mid-sized company in the bond market, investors are driving these disclosures for even, as the it's the barrier to cross to get a loan. Even if you want credit, if you want to raise a bond, and so the small and the medium companies are going to be subject to this as well. They're going to have to report this. And investors are going to before long demand this, even of small and medium companies. So it's just not, obviously that's a resource challenge for if you're a smaller producer, if you're a distributor. This is coming. So you better start preparing for it, because this is how you can be measured. It's going to affect your cost of capital and your access to capital, even if you're a small and mid-sized company.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the challenge is having the resources, but I think even the small to medium size. We did a survey, Societe de Chimie Industrielle. We have a small initiative around ESG where, at a minimum, we want to have programs like this, webcasts where we take experts and help our members and non-members understand things better. But also, we trying to gather some data. And one of the things we did is started to do some surveys of people to find out what they thought. And one thing's for sure is, at least the starting surveys of the small to medium size, they said, it doesn't affect us as much, particularly if we're not public, but we see it coming, right? It's not like, oh, they're just going to ignore us and leave us alone, right? So of course, you talk about the definitions, then you talk about the standards, and you talk about what companies are doing. Of course, the next logical question is, who's checking, right? In other words, who's monitoring these companies and making sure that they're complying or that they are reporting accurately? Clearly, at a minimum, there's a disclosure thing that Joe said from the securities market, right? That the SEC is going to say, here are things that we feel you have to disclose. And the accounting firms, similarly, they're going to be standards around audited financials and what you have to disclose. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. So any comments, gentlemen, on who's going to be watching and who's going to be the sheriff? I guess who's going to be the sheriff in town, right?
Yeah, ultimately, if you're looking for financials, the shareholders and these large groups, like the BlackRocks, they'll look out for it. But right now, ratings firms, they do use company information to create these ESG grades. You have companies like Refinitiv, MSCI, Sustainalytics, and EcoVadis, and now Fitch is rolling out its first global ESG rating solution. But it's still, it is very inconsistent. It varies widely among the ratings companies. I mean, some will put more weight on social issues, others on fossil fuel dependence. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article that it noted a wide disparity between the ESG ratings of companies among the agencies. For a company, say like for Chevron, if you look at credit ratings, the differences are very narrow, but the ESG ratings can really vary. So ESG, it's really more subjective, of course, but not impossible to evaluate. It is challenging though. And for their sustainability reports, I mean, many companies use a third-party auditor like Deloitte, EY, or KPMG. That's for data voluntarily reported. It really is self-reported and usually within a framework like the GRI and communicated mainly through sustainability reports along with direct communications to investors.
Yeah, and
Because they're getting a lot more questions on ESG. Absolutely.
in fact, we looked into some of the actual ratings and to see what was underneath what Amico Vatis or someone how they rated it. And once you get underneath, you see there's just a lot of arbitrary decisions and so forth. The famous saying that said, any data analysis is only as good as the quality of the data that you have, right? And we clearly have a case where there are a lot of people who are using data and suggesting precision well beyond what the actual underlying data would allow them to do legitimately. So some of these rankings and awards are, shall we say, a bit dubious in terms of whether they really, is based on really comprehensive and accurate analysis. Yeah. Rob, do you have a comment?
Yeah, in terms of, I think these are all good points about the ratings agencies and, the metrics and the indexes that you're saying use. But, I think at the end of the day, it's the public, including investors, that are going to hold companies to account. I mean, there was, public pressure is growing, regulatory pressure is growing, investor pressure is growing, and it's here already. There was this. They talk about these, in May, within a 7-day period, you had 3 activists added to the board at Exxon. Chevron lost a shareholder vote, or actually Chevron shareholders voted to, I don't think it was binding, but to demand that Chevron reports Scope 3 emissions against the wishes of the board and the management. And, Shell lost a case in The Hague that required it, that mandated it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% in 2030. So, there's growing societal expectations around these issues, and investors and the public are going to be the ones demanding this here. So it's already happening already. These companies are being held to account on these issues.
Yeah. Well, a really big challenge too for some of them is, like in the case of Shell, it's not just their own practices for the plants they run and drilling. They're also being told you're responsible for what the people you're downstream of you, and raw material suppliers. And for that, it's causing them all sorts of headache because they don't maybe have some influence as who their customers and who their suppliers are, but how do you? But they don't own these companies, right? And there may be limitations on how much flexibility they have in terms of being able to get the right reporting numbers, but still, preserve the profitability, right?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to point out, Peter, that you mentioned for reporting and auditing, the auditors they also, it's within their judgment of what they look at and what they measure. So that'll depend auditor to auditor. I mean, they're just going to use their judgment on what they do, and some will sample certain plants for greenhouse gas emissions. Would be great if the companies were able to continue, or if they could continually monitor those emissions and report on them.
Yeah, I think that's right. So moving on, sort of in the same logical train. So we talked about standards, we talked about companies, what they're doing to try to measure and report, and then we talked a little bit about who's watching and who's checking to see whether their reporting is correct. A logical next question is, what are the incentives, rewards, and penalties that companies are facing or believe they're facing with regard to their compliance with various ESG standards?
Yeah.
I think Rob mentioned it. It does come to cost of capital, and ultimately you can lower your cost of capital if you do a good job and can demonstrate that you're progressing on ESG fronts. I mean, you have investment, lending, and insurance, some key areas. If the issuance of green bonds, you can have dramatically lower borrowing costs, and we've seen BASF and Evonik issuing them. Evonik's did, I think, what is it, $500 million euros in 60. It was 60-year green bonds issued in August with yields of the yield was just 1.375%. BASF last year issued $2 billion in green bonds, 3 and 7-year green bonds with minuscule yields of 0.1% and 0.25%. And as mentioned, more asset managers are incorporating ESG into their investment decisions. So the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, that's the world's largest asset manager, noted a tectonic shift towards ESG investing, pointing out that more and more people understand that climate risk is investment risk. So, he's calling for more and better sustainability disclosures, and for companies also to do this now instead of waiting for regulators to impose this. And so if ESG is going to be a bigger factor driving decisions by investors and lenders, companies that are able to effectively demonstrate progress can lower their cost of capital. It becomes a financial competitive advantage. And also customers. You're looking at customer suppliers that are increasingly considering your ESG profile in deciding whether they do business with you. For example, BASF uses EcoVadis to evaluate its suppliers on an ESG basis. And just lastly, if you want to hire the best and brightest, boosting your ESG credentials are going to help. I mean, the younger generation really cares more about the impact companies are having, and they want to be part of that positive change.
Yeah. By the way, one comment for those of you who aren't following these ESG bonds, the interesting aspect is that the interest rate will go up and down, will go down if in fact the company achieves better ESG goals. So it's ironically the investor in the bonds actually saying, I will accept lower interest payments if you achieve certain ESG targets in terms of being responsible, which is pretty extraordinary, right?
Yeah.
I wonder who's buying these bonds also. I know they go into ESG funds and ultimately, but investors are, willing to accept, substantially lower payments for this.
But by the way, directly related to this issue is there have been a number of studies to try to figure out whether you get higher returns if you invest more in ESG, better ESG companies and so forth.
Equities.
And the data is not totally conclusive. There are some studies that say, investing in good ESG companies and good ESG funds, mutual funds, et cetera, you get a better return. But there are others for where the data is, it's not clear whether that's true or not. And so time will tell. But that's going to be an important factor, because if it turns out the returns to investors are lower or substantially lower if they invest in sort of quote ESG funds or ESG companies, it may or may not change the attitudes of investors, right, with regard to whether they put more money into ESG related funds or companies. Yep. But the studies they really are on both sides. Some show that the investors do better and some less, but of course it's on a relatively short time frame. So I think time will tell whether or not what the results are.
Yeah.
Bob, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I just it touches on some of the points that you both made, but I think in terms of incentives at the core, I think it goes to your access to capital or the cost of capital. I mean, it's going to be banks, lenders, investors are going to demand this information. And if you look at what BlackRock is doing, it's actively managed funds. It's out of coal, right? So there is a risk of deselection if you don't score well, and that obviously affects your access to capital or your cost of capital. You'll have to move to either private investors, private equity that carries a higher cost of capital if you're depending on your ESG disclosure and your performance. And I think more broadly, and not to sound too much like a consultant, but if you mentioned this concept of is there an ESG value premium, right, Peter? But if if you're able to integrate ESG more broadly within the operations, if you get the E right, in terms of environment, that if you can improve your efficiency, you cut energy, raw material costs, cut emissions, that obviously makes you that has some financial benefit. Joe mentioned your ability to attract and recruit talent. I mean, that's that's gonna, if you score well on S, that'll your license to operate within your communities and your ability to attract the right talent. And on the governance, governance, if you do that right, that reduces your legal and financial risk. So I think it's there is an incentive to integrate this with the operations, because if you get ESG right, that should have positive outcomes across financial metrics.
By the way,
Kind of,
just a piece of data that to support what Joe said, about how younger people may be favoring companies or people who are dealing with ESG. When we had the Societe Chemical Career Fair end of March, we had 10 companies, and one of the companies posted that one of the things they were doing was hiring some people to focus on ESG within their company, or ESG consulting. And they got a flood of, now all the companies got lots of students interested in talking, but there was a particular flood of the applicants towards this company because they indicated they were going to be hiring people to deal with the ESG thing. So that is that underscores the comment you made, Joe, which is it could be a factor in terms of younger people where they choose to land career wise, right?
Sure. And I'll just touch on what I think Rob was saying, for the investor standpoint, if you look at ESG, I think a lot of companies, you can kind of de-risk or you can aim to de-risk your investment choices.
Yep.
If companies really focused on environmental, social, governance and can demonstrate that, it's less of a risk of something going, say, terribly wrong on any of those fronts. So yeah, as an investor, you want to make sure the company is diligently addressing these critical areas, and you would look at that, at least I think from an investor standpoint, you would look at that as, okay, yeah, these companies are focusing on that, and it's less of a risk for me to invest in this company than say a company that is really not, or doesn't have those particular goals, or is not aligned to certain values and demonstrating progress in those areas.
There's another area just worth mentioning, and that is as you go through the different categories, who's imposing standards or rules can be different. And a good example of that, which is a little different from what we're talking about, is all these rules that have been passed to create diversity at the board, on boards of companies. So, for example, California passed a rule that said you had to have a certain proportion of women and minorities, right? The NASDAQ, the exchange, right, is implementing a rule which was challenged, but then it was said it's okay on the same thing, which is representation on the board and so forth, which obviously is part of the governance, right? Part of this. So independent of things, and that has nothing to do with, that's the G part, and that has nothing to do with environmental or whatever. But the standards and the enforcement, they're coming from governments, right? It's not from accounting firms. It's not from environmental and it's not from the stock market, right? The investors are not saying we won't invest unless you have X percent women or minorities, right? It's coming from a government agency, right? So that's interesting. So it's coming from a lot of different places.
Yep.
And some companies they're just putting they're putting those standards on themselves. Yeah. And it's interesting to see. I mean, it's I think there's one company it has 50% for global workforce should be women, but on the board they're aiming for a third. So why not 50%? Yeah. What's the right number? I mean,
yeah, no, that's right. Now, one of the things I would want to say is that we get caught up, we're caught up on ESG, but the reality is there's a lot of overlap with things that are not under the quote official ESG. For example, this plastics, the attack of single-use plastic, so forth. That's actually not being driven by directly by investors, so forth. That's through a whole lot of different factors and public things, including now maybe a threat that there could be a tax, per pound on single-use plastics and so forth. So for the chemical industry, that's a very special chemical industry specific issue, right? Because, McDonald's and, and Chase Bank, they don't have to deal with this because they don't make, plastics, right? But that's a serious issue that's affecting a large portion of the chemical industry, right? And they're having to figure out what to do. They're taking aggressive actions as a group, right? Funding a central group to try to deal with recycling. But I also think it's going to also affect the portfolio of these companies. I mean, companies who are who make plastics and other things, they're going to try to sort of rearrange their portfolio so it has, either they're out of that or they're more dependent on renewables, recyclables, and circular chemistry. So, any comments on that? Because I know both of you have reported on this topic pretty relentlessly, right, for some time.
Yeah, I think one consequence of more of the focus on ESG and also carbon emissions reductions in particular is that you're probably going to get less capacity coming on in some of the developed countries. So the U.S. and Europe, in terms of new capacity, who's going to build a cracker, or if you're going to build a cracker, it's going to be very expensive. It's going to have a lot of carbon mitigation technologies, and some of those are not quite ready yet. So this could really delay the addition of capacity for the companies and the countries that are focusing on that. But on plastics recycling, yeah, it's tough to measure. Yeah, some of that will not be not get through in terms of ESG. It's like, okay, a company might be developing plastics recycling technologies, and how do you reflect that in particular ESG ratings? A company that will be producing virgin plastics may also be working on mechanical and chemical recycling of plastics. But how do you how do you incorporate that in terms of the ratings as well? I mean, you can measure volumes, but some of these are still far further out in terms of significant volumes. So yeah, I think it's tough.
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think the companies don't, you have the risk of deselection to meet these standards. If you look at, Danone getting out of the bottled water business, and even like DSM getting rid of fibers and nylon. Those decisions. It's not explicit that these are driven by specifically by ESG, but it's in one sense it's these companies de-risking their portfolio, right, steering away from what they view as what their investors want and what they want. But I think things like circularity and plastics, I think those do very much tie into the ESG framework. Things around circularity, reduction of waste and pollution waste. Those are the type of metrics that will show up in ESG metrics, and companies are going to be measured on this. So it's these challenges are being obviously unique to resin makers, but I think this does fit within issues around waste and circularity are certainly going to be within ESG frameworks. And
yeah. And actually, ironically, I would agree with Joe. Ironically, it's not necessarily all bad for at least the earnings. For example, if people don't build as many plants and therefore there's less of a chance of overcapacity, at least that would allow profitability to be more stable or higher. Yeah. But it's in the long term, the writing is on the wall, and it will push a lot of companies to try to increase what proportion of their product is from renewable sources and from plastic waste, et cetera, right?
Yep.
So is it, reflecting on the big picture, is this overall good news, bad news, neutral for companies that are making chemicals or in the chemical industry? Or does it depend?
I think chemical companies, they can really do a lot. I think the companies will really look and see where they can have the most positive impact. Especially if do they have the capability to meaningfully reduce emissions? Can they produce a pipeline of products that are more sustainable and also help customers reduce their own emissions and save water or energy use? And also, yeah, they can do a lot internally, of course, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also in their communities to be better citizens and also drive positive social changes. But it's good. I mean, companies don't have any choice. The world has changed. So I think there's more focus on that. And I'll just give one quick anecdote. 15 years ago or so, I visited a coatings company, had access to the C-suite, and of course, one of the questions was on sustainable products. And back then, it really you could tell it really wasn't a priority. That's because the customers, they demanded performance, so that's what they really cared about. But again, things have changed, and now that this company is focusing, has evolved, it's focusing on having a large percentage of its products being sustainable, reducing emissions and energy intensity, and a greater focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So customers, investors, and lenders, insurers, everyone is evolving, shifting their focus towards ESG, and the chemical industry has to do the same. And some are, being very ambitious, others are going slower. But I think it's all well intentioned, and there's really a lot of positives and meaningful changes that will come out of this, I think.
Yeah, and not to. I agree with Joe there, but to also, I mean, I think good bad may not be the right lens to view this, but companies will have to do it, right? It's no longer a nice to have; it's a must have. This is what's going to determine. Your scorecard is going to be presented to investors and to the public, and I think the implications are going to be very broad. Depending on how quickly you can meet these standards. It goes right to your ability to raise capital, your ability to recruit, retain talent, and even the right to operate. So it's these sustainability and environmental CS reports. They're no longer uh, sort of overarching ambitions that are longer term targets that we'll meet, that are nice to have, but this is how you're going to be judged, and this is going to really determine your ability to succeed.
And I think there's some positives happening now that will help the chemical industry in its ESG initiatives. And one good example is clearly 20 years ago, 10 years ago, customers really weren't willing to pay a premium for chemicals based on renewable raw materials or plastics. And so they say, well, look, I'll buy it from you if it's the same and so forth, but I'm not going to pay you anything more for it, right? Now that's different. I think the ultimate end use consumers are willing to pay a premium for things that are environmentally more sound or more natural or whatever it may be, right? And as a result, the suppliers themselves, when they're making the end products or the chemicals, are increasingly willing to pay a premium. And that's a huge difference, because that means for some people, it's not like a decision to make less money in order to be more compliant. In some cases, it may turn out that they don't suffer any reduction in profits, or they might even do better, right, if they make the shift. Does that sort of make sense? As you seeing the same thing, Joe, Rob?
Yeah, it's going to be more expensive, but companies can gain market share if they can demonstrate that their products are sustainable. And so, yeah, I think and again, the companies will look at the value chain, and a company like Dow, it's like, oh, we want to make sure the value chain is there so that we can increase capacity to meet these needs. But yeah, some of the carbon mitigation technologies in particular, yeah, they're going to be expensive. They're going to be very expensive. And they do call for government support. I mean, all the companies that are investing in these technologies, and especially for reducing carbon emissions and electrifying their operations. I think BASF and RWE, they're planning a offshore wind farm project, and they want to send that electricity to Ludwigshafen, BASF's largest site in Germany. But they think, oh, there's a green tax in Germany. There's a green tax. So if you buy renewable energy, you do pay a tax on that. And they think, okay, maybe that's not very constructive to it. So they're in discussions, and I think a number of companies they've indicated, yeah, we need some government partnerships or support there, and not necessarily subsidies, but it could be a reduction in taxes. I mean, look, it is about money as well, at the end. So the companies will, but there is an opportunity. These companies, especially the companies that have the technologies and the financial resources to do this and to take a lead and really gain market share. It will be more expensive, and but if customers are willing to pay for it, and you can get more access to things like renewable energy at a relatively reasonable price to do this. So I think it's definitely doable.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say probably a whole nother session we could have, but yeah, we have to get the incentives, the economic incentives have to be aligned, right? So that's going to require some government support. It's going to require a carbon tax. You just can't have this mishmash of regional or even local standards here. Like if you take net zero, for example, you're going to need a carbon tax. You're going to need some incentives to ensure that companies can meet this in an economically viable way. That has to be right for all this to happen, and I think that's going to require enormous realignment from governments, regulators, and the publics in terms of mandates, carbon taxes, and so the incentives have to be right. And I think people know how important it is and how that this needs to get done. At some point that happens. Hopefully, it hasn't happened yet, but those incentives have to line up for this to happen.
Yeah, and I think the good news is, starting from maybe around 20 years ago, a number of companies started to say, well, there are a number of stakeholders, right?
Yeah, right.
Not just the investors, the shareholders, it's also the employees, it's the communities and so forth. And it's slowly become kind of an acceptable concept, that it's not all about just getting the absolute highest profit margin or return on investment. And I think that evolution, is allowing companies to do some of the things related to ESG that otherwise they may have felt that they didn't have the leeway to, right?
Yep.
And so I think if they continue to believe that, that'll be helpful because, Joe, as you said, not all of these will end up having a net neutral or positive impact on income, right? Some of them, to make the right decision, it'll hurt a little bit on the earnings. And so companies have to feel empowered to be able to make that decision, but not be penalized, right?
Yeah.
So now I don't see any type questions, which really means that obviously you guys have done such a superb job of answering, or the audience may have decided I'd rather ask them the question at their table. So since we have hit the 1 hour, what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank the two of you to be part of this panel with me on this topic. I hope the audience found it helpful. What we're going to do now is we're going to switch everyone into the electronic ballroom, including the speakers, and have a chance for people to network and meet with each other. So we'll see all of you in the electronic ballroom. And we also hope to see many of you at the next Societe webcast.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Peter.